Okay, so imagine this. You're a son living in America, and you find out your father in the Philippines has passed away.
Tragic.
Yeah. And to make things even more complicated, you discover he's left behind some properties.
Sounds like it could be a good thing, maybe a silver lining.
You'd think so, right?
Hmm.
But then it turns out some people claiming to be your siblings have already sold off those properties.
Oh, wow, so you're cut out of the inheritance.
Exactly. And that's what happened in this wild Supreme Court case we're diving into today. It's all about inheritance, land ownership, and whether you can actually buy something if the seller had no right to sell it in the first place.
I mean, that's a question that gets to the heart of property rights, doesn't it? You can't just sell something you don't own, can you?
Well, that's the legal principle at play here, and it's fascinating to see how the Supreme Court grappled with it. This whole saga starts with Frank Colmenar, a U.S. citizen who learns about his father's death and the properties in Cavite. But when he tries to claim his inheritance,
That's when the plot thickens.
yeah, out of nowhere, these three individuals pop up claiming to be his siblings, Apollo Genie and Victoria Colmenar.
And I'm guessing they believe they're the rightful heirs.
That's right. They'd already divided up the properties and even sold some of them off to different companies.
Okay, so now we've got more players entering the scene. Companies who might have unknowingly bought land that wasn't actually for sale.
Exactly. We're talking about Philippine Estates Corporation, or PEC Amaya Land Corporation, Crescenta Realty, and Property Company of Friends. They all maintained that they were innocent purchasers. They did their due diligence and had no idea about this inheritance drama when they bought the properties.
So they're essentially saying, hey, we acted in good faith. We shouldn't be punished for something the sellers did wrong.
It's a classic good faith argument. But does it actually hold up in court when the sellers never had the right to sell the land in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's where this case gets really interesting. The Supreme Court had to decide whether good faith outweighs that fundamental principle that you can't give what you don't have.
You know, it's like that old saying, you can't squeeze blood from a stone. You can't transfer ownership of something you don't own.
Exactly. And the legal term for that is nemo dat quod non habet. It's a Latin phrase that's central to this whole case.
Latin always makes legal battles sound even more epic. But let's back up for a second. How did this even end up in the Supreme Court?
Well, Frank wasn't going to back down without a fight. He filed a lawsuit, and that set off a legal battle that went through the Philippine courts all the way to the top.
I bet that was a long and stressful process.
Oh, absolutely. The case, officially titled Frank Colmenar in his capacity as an heir of the late Francisco Colmenar versus Apollo, Colmenar, Genie Colmenar Mendoza, Victoria Jet Colmenar Philippine Estates Corporation, Amaya Land Corporation, Crescenta Realty Development Corporation, Property Company of Friends, and the Register of Deeds of the Province of Cavite. GR-No 252467 was decided on June 21, 2021.
Okay, so we've got the official case name and date for anyone who wants to look it up. Now tell me what happened at the Supreme Court. Did they side with Frank?
Well, it's not that straightforward. The Supreme Court actually found a pretty significant error in how the lower courts handled the case.
Really? What kind of error?
It all boils down to this. The judge in the lower court decided to apply the 2019 amendments to the rules of civil procedure.
Okay, and
The problem is the case was originally filed back in 2018 before those amendments even existed.
so they basically changed the rules of the game in the middle of the match.
That's a good way to put it. And the Supreme Court emphasized that while procedural rules can sometimes be applied retroactively, they shouldn't be used if it creates an unfair disadvantage for one of the parties.
I can see how that would be a problem.
Yeah, in this case, the Supreme Court felt that using those 2019 amendments actually prejudiced Frank's rights. He was deprived of the chance to properly respond and potentially appeal those earlier decisions made in his case.
So it's a matter of fairness and making sure everyone has a chance to present their side of the story.
Exactly. Legal procedure might seem like a technicality, but it's crucial for a just legal system.
All right, so we've got this procedural drama going on. But what about the core issue here? Did the Supreme Court say anything about the validity of that land sale and Frank's inheritance rights?
That's where that Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet, comes back into play. The Supreme Court highlighted that because the alleged siblings weren't the legitimate owners, they never had the right to sell that land in the first place. So any sale they made was basically invalid from the get-go.
So even if the companies bought the properties in good faith, the sale is still no good because the sellers didn't actually own the land.
Precisely. The court made it very clear that the Torrens system of land registration in the Philippines is designed to protect property rights, and that includes safeguarding the interests of heirs like Frank.
Now, I'm thinking about all the people out there who've bought property. Does this mean everyone has to go on a wild goose chase tracking down every potential heir just to be safe?
It's definitely not feasible to do that for every property purchase, but this case definitely highlights the importance of due diligence.
So what's the takeaway for someone buying property?
You got to do your homework. Do a thorough title search, examine the chain of ownership. If anything seems off or raises red flags, that's your cue to dig deeper.
All right, so we've established that the companies might be in a tough spot here.
Yeah.
But what about their investments? Can they get their money back?
That's a great question, and the Supreme Court decision doesn't explicitly address that. It's possible the companies could try to take legal action against the folks who sold them the land.
So basically argue that they were misled or defrauded and try to recover their losses that way.
Exactly. But proving that in court is a whole other challenge. This situation really underscores why it's crucial to have legal experts involved in property transactions.
I bet real estate lawyers are getting a lot of calls after this ruling. But you know what I'm wondering? Why should our listeners care about this case? It involves a Filipino-American heir and some land in Cavite. It all seems kind of specific.
You'd be surprised how relevant this case can be. Inheritance laws might not be on everyone's mind, but this case shows just how crucial they are, especially if you have family ties to the Philippines or any plans to invest in property there.
That's a good point. It's a reminder that these legal issues can hit closer to home than you might think.
Absolutely. And there's another layer to this. The fact that the lower court applied those 2019 amendments retroactively became a major sticking point. This case shows how laws and procedures can change and how those changes can really impact ongoing legal battles.
It's a reminder that the legal system is constantly evolving. And that's why it's so important to have legal professionals who are up to date on the latest developments.
Couldn't agree more. Keeping up with those changes can make all the difference in a case like this.
So we've uncovered family secrets, legal battles, complex legal concepts. It's been quite a deep dive so far. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of what happened to the companies and what lessons we can learn from all of this, let's take a quick break and we'll be back in a flash. So the companies are saying they were innocent purchasers. Did the Supreme Court buy that?
Well, that's where the Supreme Court had to really weigh things carefully because you've got these companies saying they bought these properties in good faith, without any knowledge of this inheritance dispute going on.
Yeah, it does seem a bit unfair to penalize them if they genuinely thought everything was on the up and up.
Right. But ultimately, the Supreme Court said that nemo, that quod non habet, that principle we talked about, that you can't give what you don't have, they said that trumps the good faith argument in this specific case.
So even if they had no idea about the inheritance issues, the sale is still invalid because the sellers didn't actually own the land.
Exactly. The court was really emphasizing that the torn system we use here in the Philippines for land registration, it's designed to protect property rights, you see. And that includes looking out for the interests of heirs like Frank.
That makes sense, but this is where my brain starts to spin a little bit.
Yeah.
Does this mean anyone buying property has to go out and track down every single potential heir? I mean, that could take forever.
Well, yeah, it wouldn't be practical to go to those extremes for every single property purchase. But the key takeaway here is due diligence.
So what would you say is the most important thing for someone buying property to keep in mind?
Really, it's about being thorough.
Mm-hmm.
Conducting a thorough title search, making sure you look into the chain of ownership, and if anything seems inconsistent or there are some red flags that pop up.
That's when you got to dig deeper.
Exactly. You want to make sure that the seller actually has the right to sell what they're offering.
So we've got these companies who bought land that technically wasn't theirs to buy. What happens to their investments now? Can they get their money back?
That's a really good question. And honestly, the Supreme Court decision didn't give us a clear-cut answer on that one. It's possible that they could take legal action against the people who sold them the land.
So they could try to argue they were misled or defrauded and try to recoup their losses that way?
Exactly. But proving that in court, that's another battle altogether. This whole situation really emphasizes why it's so important to bring in legal experts, especially when you're dealing with property transactions.
I bet you're right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure real estate lawyers are pretty busy after this ruling. But something I've been thinking about this whole time is, why should our listeners care about this case? I mean, it's about a Filipino-American heir and some land in Cavite. It all seems very specific.
You might think so, but inheritance laws might not be something we think about every day, but they are incredibly important, and this case really highlights that, especially if you have family in the Philippines or you're planning to maybe invest in property there.
I see your point. It's a reminder that these legal issues can pop up in ways we might not expect.
Exactly. And there's another interesting aspect here. Remember how the lower court applied those 2019 amendments retroactively? That became a big deal in this case. It really shows how laws and procedures can change
Yeah.
and how those changes can have a huge impact on legal battles that are already in progress.
It's like the legal system is this constantly moving target.
That's one way to put it, and that's why it's so important to have legal professionals involved who really understand the latest developments in the judicial system.
Knowledge is power.
Absolutely. Staying informed can make all the difference in cases like this.
Okay, so we've uncovered family secrets, legal battles, complex legal concepts. It's been a real journey so far.
Hmm.
What would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners up to this point?
For me, it all comes back to knowledge and preparation. This case shines a light on how important it is to understand inheritance laws and take those steps to protect yourself, especially when it comes to property.
I think a lot of people assume inheritance is pretty straightforward. But this case shows how messy it can get, especially when you throw in land ownership and potential disputes between heirs.
That's a great point. I think this case should be a wake-up call for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation.
So let's say someone's listening right now and they realize they've inherited property in the Philippines. Or maybe they're worried about potential inheritance issues down the road. What advice would you give them?
First things first, find a lawyer and do it quickly.
Someone who specializes in inheritance and property law in the Philippines.
Exactly. They can walk you through the process, make sure you know your rights, and help you navigate the legal system.
Because let's be honest, the legal system can be a bit of a maze even in your own country, let alone in a country where you might not be familiar with all the laws and procedures.
That's why having a lawyer is so crucial. They can help you get all the necessary documents, figure out if there are other potential heirs involved, and advise you on the best way to move forward.
It's like having a guide when you're exploring unfamiliar territory.
Exactly. They can help you determine if it's possible to come to some kind of agreement with the other heirs, or if you need to take legal action to protect your inheritance.
This case also got me thinking about how important it is to have open communication within families. It seems like some of this could have been avoided if everyone had been more transparent about the father's assets and what he wanted to happen with his estate.
I think that's a really crucial point. Sometimes those conversations about inheritance are difficult to have, but being open and honest can prevent a lot of misunderstandings and potential legal battles down the road.
It's better to address these issues head on instead of letting them simmer and potentially cause rifts within the family.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else you'd like to add for our listeners about how to avoid ending up in a similar inheritance situation?
I think it comes down to a few key things. First, get familiar with inheritance laws, especially if you have any assets or family ties in the Philippines. Second, have those tough conversations with your family about inheritance plans and expectations. And finally, if you're ever unsure or facing a potential dispute, don't hesitate to seek legal advice from an expert in Philippine law.
Those are all excellent points. Being proactive and informed can really save you from a lot of headaches and heartache in the future.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We've gone from family secrets to legal battles to some pretty complex legal concepts. Hopefully our listeners have a better understanding now of the intricacies of inheritance and land ownership here in the Philippines.
I hope so too. It's been a pleasure diving into this case with you, and I hope our listeners found this deep dive informative and engaging. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends and family. You never know who might benefit from this information.
So much to unpack in this case. It's like we've peeled back layer after layer of complexity.
Definitely, and that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, right? We start with what seems like a simple question about inheritance, but then we end up exploring these fundamental legal principles and the inner workings of the Philippine legal system.
Exactly. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that knowledge is power.
Absolutely. I always say the more you know, the better equipped you are to navigate these kinds of situations.
This case really highlights how crucial it is to understand inheritance laws and take those steps to protect your interests, especially when property is involved.
Right, because a lot of people assume inheritance is pretty cut and dry, but this case shows how messy things can get, especially with land ownership and potential disputes between heirs.
It's a reminder that we can't just assume everything will work itself out. We need to be proactive.
Exactly. And that's why I think this case is so important for our listeners. It's a wake-up call.
So let's say someone's listening right now and they suddenly realize they've inherited property in the Philippines, or maybe they're worried about potential inheritance issues down the road. What should they do?
Honestly, the first and most important step is to talk to a lawyer. Don't wait. Get legal counsel as soon as possible.
Someone who specializes in inheritance and property law here in the Philippines.
Exactly. You want someone who really knows the ins and outs of the Philippine legal system. They can guide you through the process, make sure you understand your rights, and help you navigate all the complexities.
Because the legal system can be intimidating even in your own country, let alone when you're dealing with laws and procedures in a different country.
That's why having a lawyer on your side is so crucial. They can help you gather all the necessary documents, figure out if there are other heirs involved, and advise you on the best course of action.
It's like having a roadmap and a compass when you're venturing into uncharted territory.
That's a great analogy. They can help you figure out if it's possible to reach an agreement with the other heirs, or if you need to take legal action to protect what's rightfully yours.
You know, this whole case also got me thinking about the importance of communication within families. It seems like some of these issues could have been avoided if there had been more open and honest conversations about the father's assets and his wishes for his estate.
You're absolutely right. Those conversations about inheritance can be tough, but they're so important. Being upfront and transparent can prevent a lot of misunderstandings and potential legal battles in the future.
It's much better to address these issues head-on rather than letting them fester and potentially create divisions within the family.
Couldn't agree more. So before we wrap up this deep dive, any final words of wisdom for our listeners on how to steer clear of these inheritance pitfalls?
I think it boils down to three key things. First, familiarize yourself with inheritance laws, particularly if you have any assets or family connections in the Philippines. Second, have those tough conversations with your family about inheritance plans and expectations. And third, if you're ever in doubt or facing a potential dispute, don't hesitate to seek legal advice from an expert in Philippine law.
Those are all excellent points. Being proactive and informed is the best way to protect yourself and ensure a smoother inheritance process.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We've gone from family secrets and legal battles to the intricacies of land ownership and inheritance law here in the Philippines.
It's amazing how one case can lead us down so many different paths.
Hopefully our listeners have gained some valuable insights from our deep dive today.
I hope so too. Remember, knowledge is power, and when it comes to inheritance, being informed and prepared can make all the difference. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of inheritance intrigue. We'll see you next time for another fascinating legal exploration.